Throughout the continent known as Tamriel, many different races of humans, elves, and others such as orcs and Argonians live amongst one another in harmony most of the time. Each from their own part of Tamriel, their lands would be filled with their own culture, unique traditions, and ways of life, as well as their landscapes looking dramatically different. From the central city of Cyrodiil to the harsh lands of Morrowind, to the swamps of the Black Marsh and the deserts of Hammerfell. All of these areas would be so iconic and unique, helping each race to really define who they are and their all-round history. One area, however, would be a cold, harsh land that has an extremely ancient history. This land would be the first land of Tamriel that man would set up on, with the first settlers naming it as the throat of the world. This land would be located at the top of Tamriel, and as of the 4th era would be known as Skyrim, home of the Nords. But life was never simple here within this newly found land. In fact, from the moment the first men came over to Skyrim, it would see countless wars amongst humans and other races. It would see the building of new cities as well as the destruction of those same cities within a matter of months or years, and even to this date sees new threats to its people and infrastructure throughout the rise of more civil wars and the return of the dragons of legend. But what is the story of Skyrim? When was it first discovered and set up by the first men? What has happened over the many eras, and where does it stand now during the 4th era? Well, in today's video we will look at the whole history of the land known as Skyrim, as well as its native people known as the Nords. This is the full history of the northern lands of Tamriel, known as Skyrim. Way before the events of the Oblivion Crisis in Cyrodiil and the dragons returning within the 4th era Skyrim, there was a time known as the Merethic era. During this time, the elven people were the thriving race within Tamriel, but sadly not much is recorded about what went on in that time period. What is known is that during this time, the beast people of Tamriel, such as the Khajiit, Argonians, Slode, and most likely Orsimer, lived together as one in pre-illiterate communities throughout all of Tamriel, with the beast people also lived the Oldmer, the first folk of elves, who were primarily located in the lands of the Somerset Isles. But during this era, these elves would venture out of this land to expand their settlements across the coastlands of Tamriel. The High Elves, who also lived within Tamriel, moved inwards to the centre of the continent and went on to set up the area that would be later known as Cyrodiil. But as the elves moved out of their homes to seek other opportunities, the race of men were busy within their continent that was known as Atmoran. Things were not fine within Atmoran, however, as a brutal civil war waged amongst its people. This led to thousands seeking shelter as their cities and towns were destroyed in the war. Because of this, one proud Atmoran warrior, known as Ysgramor, along with his 2 sons, Yungol and Yolgar, led a group of survivors across the Sea of Ghosts down until they finally came into contact with the continent of Tamriel, a place that had been spoken about before by a few travellers in their society. Safely arriving, the group would land at Zarek Head at the northern tip of the frozen land and would begin seeking out an area to set up their new home. As they were relieved to find new land and be safe away from their civil war back home, they would go on to name this new land as Merethic, due to meeting the weird inhabitants of this land, the elves, that would call themselves Mer. Ysgramor was sick of war and violence at this point in his life because of the civil war in Atmoran, and now that they were in new land, used this as an opportunity to live a peaceful life and explore. Hearing of Ysgramor's escape from the civil war and setting up a new life on a new land, hundreds of other Atmorans followed in suit and travelled to Merethic. Eventually, the Atmora, or human population, was so large on Tamriel that they were able to finally build their own settlements on the land to expand their civilization. With this, they would set up the city of Sarthal in the upper part of the lands. This was great for all of the humans who had travelled there. Finally, they could live that peaceful life once again and rebuild what they had lost in Atmora. But whilst this was positive news for them, the Mer, on the other hand, were becoming increasingly worried about how fast the human population was growing and knew this would be a huge issue for their own species, as the humans' culture might also dominate over theirs. With this, the Mer, more specifically the Snow Elves, raided the human settlements, especially their new city of Sarthal, and with that raid, all of the humans were supposedly killed within just one single night, all apart from Ysgramor and his 2 sons, who escaped during the attacks. Desperate to seek revenge for the slaughter, Ysgramor set sail back to the land of Atmoran to find fellow soldiers who were willing to fight back and seek revenge for their slaughtered brothers and sisters in Merethic. This attack would be so significant in human history that it would go on to be labelled as the Night of Tears, the period where peaceful coexistence with the mare would be instantly destroyed. It was also said that on top of all of this, that the attack on the humans at Sarthal was also done so that the Snow Elves could retrieve the powerful Eye of Magnus, which the Atmoran had discovered below the city. With the humans now out of the way, the Snow Elves could retrieve this Eye of Magnus, and with it, its power. But this was only a theory, and not necessarily documented as fact. With Ysgramor and his sons making his way back across the Sea of Ghosts, they would arrive back at Atmoran and tell tales of the events that occurred within Sarthal. Fueled by the hatred of elves, Ysgramor would rally together a new crew of warriors, wanting their own revenge, and eventually set up his army known as the 500 Companions, and with it the next period of their history known as the Return. On the final day of passage, as the army headed back to Merethic, their fleet was hindered once again as they were hit by a storm called the Storm of Separation. Here Ysgramor's sons were separated by it, and sadly only Yolgar was able to survive. Losing his son enraged Ysgramor even more as he set out on his own into the storm to seek out Yungol. But unfortunately, when he came across the shipwreck, Yungol and his crew had been slain by sea ghosts. With this news, Ysgramor supposedly slew all of the ghosts in an act of revenge and burnt them. To honour his son, he would bury him in traditional ways within a barrow, and went on to name that specific barrow as the Yungol Barrow, a significant location that would play a major part in their story going forward. As Ysgramor and his army of 500 marched onto Sarthal to reclaim it from the Snow Elves, they would come into contact with a lone magical man known as Arzadel, another survivor of the fall of Sarthal. After the attack, he had ventured all over the lands of Tamriel, researching the magical ways to help also seek revenge on the Snow Elves. With both of their goals being the same thing, Arzadel shared the gifts of his learnings with Ysgramor's army to help them become more powerful in taking out the elves who had betrayed them. This helped all of the warriors to enchant their weapons, creating extremely powerful steel weapons. Now fully prepared, Ysgramor's army, with the help of 2 longboats, the Kalkaz and Seidon Wraith, fought the elves within the area that would be later named as Eastmarch. The biggest battle was known as the Battle of Mosring, where Ysgramor's army would cut through the Snow Elves with ease thanks to their clearly superior weaponry, and it was said that the slopes of Mosring ran red with elf blood. For the most part, it looked like the Companions had won, but the tides changed as the Snow Prince showed up on his brilliant steed of plaided white, and with his armour and weaponry beaming with magicka, was able to inspire the remaining members of the Snow Elves army. With this new inspiration, the Snow Elves were able to hit back hard, wiping out several of the mightiest warriors from Ysgramor's army. But the Snow Prince became arrogant and forgot his way, and in a random event, he went to kill an innocent woman right in front of her 12-year-old daughter, and witnessing this, the young girl named Fina threw her dead mother's sword at the prince, which struck him in the breast, killing him then and there. With the Snow Prince now laying dead, this shattered the spirit of the remaining Snow Elf warriors, and the battle was essentially over for them. Ysgramor's forces could now wipe them from the battlefield and claim their revenge. And soon after this victory, as the army returned home, Ysgramor would seek to build a great city where his son's grave lay. This city would be set up to be an impenetrable fortress, with a great bridge built over the White River so that no elf could attempt to get in and avenge their kin. Using the elves as slaves to build the full city, it would be here where the first city of the Nords would be set up, and it would be named as Windhelm. This great city would be a monument to the glories of mankind, and a place where he could look upon his son's final resting place, and as quoted by him, feel that his line would know peace in this new home that was never known in Atmoran. The return was a success, and now was the time for the race of the Nords to build up their culture and make a name for themselves within the new lands of Tamriel. But their warring days were not over, and as they continued to build coming out of the Merethic era, they would encounter more problems amongst their people and other species. As Ysgramor was victorious in his revenge against the Snow Elves, he would not only take out their armies, but he would also seek to wipe them out from all over the lands of what would be Skyrim. And as they did, the Nords were now able to secure the region and lay down the foundations for Ysgramor's dynasty. But on top of that, the companions also went into a war against the giants who also lived throughout the region. Hundreds of giants at this point were slain in battles until they cornered the legendary giant known as Sinmir within his barrow. Both him and Ysgramor fought each other, but Sinmir was no match to Ysgramor's mighty axe Wulthrat, as it was driven into his skull. With Sinmir's death, the giants retreated into smaller groups and never became a threat to the companions or the humans ever again. As Ysgramor and his companions started to set up the city of Windhelm, they would also begin to split off into different parts of the region, with one crew from the ship known as Jorvaskir locating a monument that they would name as the Skyforge that was said to be as old as the planet of Nirn itself. Seeing this as a monument of extreme importance, this crew led by Jeek of the River would build a city around it and name that city Whiterun, giving the humans two crucial cities of Windhelm, Ysgramor's legacy, and Whiterun, home of the Skyforge. But when the day came when Ysgramor eventually died, the whole of Tamriel was plunged into mourning, as his legacy was remembered by placing a statue of him within his first city of Windhelm, and his final resting place was set up near to where they had first landed all those years ago, escaping their lands from the Civil War. This was decided by Ysgramor himself, who said he wanted to look out across the Sea of Ghosts at the land where he was once born. Whilst his bloodline would rule for years to come, Ysgramor's leaving would hit Tamriel hard, as their bold leader was now resting within Sovngarde. But as the Atmorans had now started building up their new region of Skyrim, not only did they bring with them their people to help build up these cities, but they also brought with them their history and culture, which included their religion. This religion was specifically the worship of animal gods, with the apex god being the dragon. Within Atmora, dragon priests would be significant figures within their society, governing how it ran and giving them beings to always look up to. And now, as the Atmorans had ventured out, the same applied within Tamriel. As their religion grew throughout the years, so did the arrogance of the dragons themselves, most notably Elduin, the chief of the dragons, who encouraged this practice amongst their people. With the religion prospering, the dragons would believe they held so much more power over the mortals, and they were naturally superior to not only man, but also the elves. However, as the dragons became power hungry, giving more power to the dragon priests in return for their complete obedience, man hit back against Elduin and his dragons, and so triggered the Dragon War. Despite some magic at their disposal, the dragons obliterated man thanks to their overwhelming size and ferocity, as well as their unique power of the voice. But seeing this, the gods sought to intervene to help man fight back against this powerful foe. Kin, the mother of men, and the goddess of storm, sent the dragon, Paarthurnax, brother of Elduin, to assist mankind by teaching them the power of the voice. With Paarthurnax helping mankind, some of the dragons turned against Elduin and sided with him to aid humanity. But this turned even more in man's favour when they learnt the shout known as Dragonrend, which would force the concept of mortality onto the dragon, something it couldn't comprehend, and temporarily force it to land, giving man a chance to kill it. Thanks to this involvement of Paarthurnax and kin, the ancient Nords were able to turn the tides of war, with some of the fiercest warriors taken to the summit of the throat of the world to fight Elduin. After a fierce battle that waged on, the hero known as Feldir used an Elder Scroll to banish Elduin from the flow of time, creating a time wound. With this, the Dragon War was at an end, and man was victorious. However, on the outside, some of the dragon priests still remained out there, as well as the dragon burial mounds, and many hoped that one day Elduin would return, raise back the dragons as well as the faithful ones, and take their seats as their gods once again. But this war did help the Nords set up a new belief, tradition, and also a prophecy. This was that amongst them within their society shall lie a dragonborn, a warrior capable of the way of the dragon, utilizing the power of the voice to hit back against the dragons and help humanity win them over. The first of this power was the dragonborn known as Merethic, who unfortunately denied helping the Nords Nords fight the dragons during this war, and because of that was punished by the same warriors who shut down Alduin. Over the upcoming eras, rumours of new Dragonborns would spread out, but until the dragons ultimately returned, this title was only something the Nords would use as a thing to strive for, a way of life, and something that would help boost their culture all across Tamriel. But with the war now over, Tamriel had now entered the First Era. Within Skyrim, the 13th of Ysgramor's dynasty, King Harald, started distancing himself from the holdings within Atmoran, stating that the people of Skyrim were independent and were not to be ruled or seen as the same as the groups of the Atmoran. This brought about a time of real identity as the people of Skyrim became proud of who they were, finally distancing themselves from their harsh land of Atmoran. After King Harald's death, however, his second son, Thraj the Gifted, started the expansion of man that would lead to the first empire of men. Within 50 years of his rule, the Nords of Skyrim now fully ruled Skyrim, High Rock, Cyrodiil, and the Dunmer lands of Morrowind. Morrowind's acquisition, however, was a bloody task and was remembered badly by the Dunmer, as many of their kind were slaughtered in the process. This invasion brought about the joining of both the Chima and Dwemer, two completely different factions, to form one council, and together would aim to drive out the Nords. This ultimately would work in their favour, and because of it, the Nords had to give up the lands as the power of the Chima Dwemer kingdom was too much for them to handle. This event arguably triggered a time of panic for the people of Skyrim, as they had a real loss of any united leadership, as well as a waning of the Nordic Empire's power and influence over Tamriel as a whole. By the year 369 in their First Era, the High King Borgas, the last living heir of the Ysgramor dynasty, was killed by the Wild Hunt, a Bosmer-conducted ritual that would form a creature formed of chaos. This left Skyrim completely leaderless, with enemies everywhere they look, making the end of the first empire of the Nords. Because the moot set up by the dynasty was so useless, this meant a civil war broke out all over Skyrim as each faction sought for overall power. This started yet another war named the War of Succession, but unfortunately not much was documented about the actual war itself. The only thing of note that was written down was that at some point the city of Windhelm was besieged and sacked. But because of all these battles happening between the western holds of Whiterun and Solitude and the old holds of Windhelm and Winterhold, this meant that their holds on other areas of Tamriel started to wane, as the Nords' presence within High Rock was overthrown as well. The same happened within Morrowind, as the Nords would lose all of their territory due to the Chima Dwemer army at the Battle of Red Mountain. Almost a century later, within the year 420 in the First Era, the War of Succession ended as the Pact of Chieftains crowned one Olaf One-Eye as High King, bringing back some form of stability to the region. With this, the Crown of Verity was created as a replacement for the Jagged Crown, which Ysgramor once used. But this crown caused more controversy after Olaf's reign, as it rejected the Moot's choice of king, Asern Icebreaker. But with Asern being ignored, he was then killed by Keurig the White, who then took the crown for himself. But like with all things, with Keurig being in charge of Skyrim, his relationship with Cyrodiil and Emperor Gorius soured, and because of it he rebelled against Cyrodiil's rule, sending an army to take them out. But during the Battle of Sungard within the year 477, Keurig was killed, causing more controversy between Skyrim and the Alessian army of Cyrodiil, with many more heirs to the crown being killed in the process. As this war against the Alessian army waged on, a new High King would take power, this being King Wulfharth, who would continue to fight back against the Alessian order. During his power, Wulfharth brought back the Nordic pantheon, the religion that worshipped the 8 divines. As he did this, he also went on to win the war against the Alessian army, and quickly after that war, waged war against the Orcs. Wulfharth's time within power and after became something of legend throughout not just Skyrim, but the whole of Tamriel, as he became known as the Underking and the Ash King, dealing with many of the different divines and gaining back the land for the Nords, fighting back against the Chima Dwemer army once again. In his actions as the High King, he would battle it out at the Red Mountain within Morrowind, and whilst he did have the power of the voice at his disposal, he would be killed by the Chima warlord Nerevar and his dagger known as Keening, yet another devastating blow caused by the Chima Dwemer alliance. As Skyrim entered the Second Era, its path remained relatively the same, keeping the Moton to elect kings, assassinations taking place of these kings, and wars taking place all over Tamriel as they tried desperately to take over land or recover it once again. As time progressed, the people of Skyrim would face face a new threat, that being the Akaviri, who would go on to invade Tamriel from their own continent of Akavir. These warriors were fierce as they took over Windhelm and killed the Skyrim Queen and her heir Nirnhild. Skyrim's troops from the eastern areas rallied together and with it summoned the spirit of Wolfhearth to help the Nords in their battles. Due to these huge battles that saw the sieging of major Skyrim cities, the Ebonheart Pact was formed, the joining of the Nords of Skyrim, the Dunmer of Morrowind, and the Argonians of Blackmarsh. With the large invasion of the Akaviri, the three races put aside all of their differences and histories to make sure their territory was heavily protected and they could become a super force throughout all of Tamriel. As the Ebonheart Pact grew in size to become one of the largest in all of Tamriel, they would go on a conquest to take over Cyrodiil as it lay without any leader. During this event, the Nords and Bretons would occupy the fortress of Sancre-Tor. General Tiber Septim saw this and with a group of tired, cold and ill-equipped men looked to besiege the tower. Leaving outside the walls a small force, Tiber Septim would hope that it would tempt the Nord and Breton forces inside into a battle, forcing them out of their protected walls, whilst a larger force would approach from the rear and surprise attack them. This plan was a complete success as the Nord Breton forces were overwhelmed by Tiber's tactics. Tiber Septim had won the battle, and because of this victory, the Nord captives swore allegiance to his campaign to reunite Cyrodiil and end the war for it between all of the factions. By the end of the Second Era, however, Skyrim had been fully restored and unified. It is unknown how and why this happened. However, with the help the Nords gave to Tiber Septim after the Battle of Sancre-Tor, it was assumed that Tiber Septim helped restore it once again before he became known as the deity known as Talos for centuries to come. For now though, Skyrim and its people were back to the way things were before the invasion of the Akavir, and now going into the Third Era, they could go back to rebuilding their region, especially now that the war for Cyrodiil was over, thanks to Tiber Septim becoming the Emperor of Cyrodiil. Entering into the Third Era, Cyrodiil was the main powerhouse of Tamriel, with the Imperial race seen as some of the most intellectual throughout all of the lands, with the most influence in everything. Whilst to be a true Imperial, you had to be from the central area. This did not mean they stayed there, with many Imperial areas being dotted over the many other regions of Tamriel. This caused some events that would go down in each area's history. One significant event that happened within Skyrim during this era was thanks to a single Imperial princess named Potima Septim, who would later be referred to as the Wolf Queen. Potima was married at the young age of 14 years old to the then King of Solitude, Mantiarco. During their marriage, however, Potima would go on to have many miscarriages, destroying any hope that she could give birth to a potential heir for the king. But eventually she was able to give birth to a child named Uriel Septim. But with this, Potima sought after the goal of making Uriel the true heir. Here she planted suspicion in the king's mind, stating that his first boy with his ex-wife was not truly his and that it was someone else's. This eventually led to the king naming Uriel as his one true and only heir. As time progressed, Potima's father and Emperor of Tamriel died, and with it brought about a new emperor in her brother. Potima tried desperately to ruin this for him, sending a threatening blackmail letter to him claiming he was a bastard, but this would ultimately fail for her. Eventually, King Mantiarco died during the spring of that year, and with that death, Uriel became King of Solitude, ruling with his mother. As Potima went around Skyrim entertaining nobles as well as High Rock and Morrowind, she would continue spreading harsh rumours about her brother the Emperor. After a while, her brother would die, leaving his daughter in charge. Potima as well as Uriel immediately jumped on this and accused the new Emperor to once again be a bastard, to take her down from her position as Emperor. But the Elder Council ignored her, and as she returned to Solitude mad with rage at the dismissal, she started assembling troops to go to war to take the throne. As soon as the new emperor had been crowned, battles began all over as Uriel and Potima sent their troops to High Rock, as well as attacking imperial forts along the eastern islands of Morrowind. This worked in Uriel's favour as they had split their forces and could make a direct charge towards the imperial city, taking it within just a fortnight and capturing the emperor. Uriel had now won the crown for himself, but with this act in the year 121 of the Third Era, war had been officially declared and troops were ready to fight in the War of the Red Diamond. During this war, many big battles took place involving many of the different races. At the Battle of Falconstar in 127, Argonian forces under the rule of Magnus Septim attacked Queen Pottima's forces, but were sadly overwhelmed by the legions of troops they had at their disposal, defeating Magnus Septim in the process. At this same time within Ishidad, Uriel Septim faced Sepphoris Septim, the brother of Pottima. Uriel with his large force held off Sepphoris for a long time, but eventually their forces were too strong, and because of it, Uriel was defeated and captured. Pottima, after her victory, heard word of the battle involving Uriel and her brother, as well as his capture, and tried desperately to fight back and get to him. However, whilst being transported to his prison awaiting trial, an angry mob stopped his prison carriage and burnt him alive. This news spread extremely fast all over the land, and with it, many of Pottima's allies deserted her and swore allegiance to Sepphoris as the new emperor of Tamriel. Pottima did not quit, however. Now filled with rage, she continued to hit back against their forces using necromancy and Daedra to fight for her. This would continue on for a good 10 years until eventually she would be reportedly killed within the year 137 after a long siege within the Blue Palace in solitude. Just before she died, however, Pottima would supposedly infect her castle with evil, as well as passing a charmed wolf pendant onto her nephew, Pelagus III. This would reportedly explain the madness that would take over him in his later years. But things didn't get easier for the people of Tamriel going into the 5th century of the Third Era, as Oblivion Gates opened all throughout the lands, with Meron's Dagon attempting to take over all of mortal kind, triggering the Oblivion Crisis. But after a long, brutal war, one individual was able to stop all of the Daedra and Meron's Dagon and bring back peace to the realm. But now going into the 4th era, things didn't get any better, as within the 5th year of that era, the Red Mountain within Morrowind would erupt, destroying almost all of the land around it. This forced all of the Dunmer living within these lands to flee from their homeland and seek shelter in nearby regions, most significantly Skyrim. In response to this, the High King of Skyrim at the time gave the Dunmer the island of Solstheim, allowing them a place to rebuild after they had lost so much. 4 years after these decisions, the Decree of Monument was signed by the Jarls to, quote, decree this site as a monument to the struggle of those who fled their native home of Morrowind in the time following the Red Year. Skyrim was thriving once again, with all of its holds responding well to its stability of a High King again. And now they weren't at war, they could build up their cities once again. But once again, in the year of 174 of this era, a group of Reachmen would rebel against their higher-ups. This was helped thanks to the Empire fighting the Aldmeri Dominion within Cyrodiil, leaving Markath completely undefended by them, allowing the natives to march back in there and take it back. This outcry from the native population would lead on to the events known as the Forsworn Rebellion, as they attempted to create an independent kingdom away from the outsiders' rule. As the Reachmen took Markath for themselves, this triggered the elders and Jarl of Markath to seek outsider help to take it back once again. Here the Jarl enlisted the help of Ulfric Stormcloak to take back the city from the Reachmen, stating if they were successful, they would be free to worship Talos freely, something that was just recently outlawed after the Great War of Cyrodiil. With this, Ulfric stormed into the city, utilizing his power of the voice, and anyone who could fight against them, eventually overthrowing the rebels and taking back the city. Ulfric was brutal in this, however, with some reports claiming he would punish anyone who did not help them in their fight, regardless of who they were, from shop owners, elderly, farmers, and even children old enough to hold a sword. With this battle over, however, the remaining Reachmen would retreat to the hills of the Reach and become known as the Forsworn, and would be hostile to anyone venturing into their lands. This victory saw the Jarl honour Ulfric's wishes of worshipping Talos, and this went on for a good few years. However, the new co-rulers of the Thalmor quickly heard of this ignoring of their terms, thanks to the Jarl of Markath's betrayal, and demanded that Ulfric and his men be arrested for breaking the new laws, or they would have to face another war. Jarl Ulfric accepted his fate, and he and his men were arrested as the Thalmor came to Skyrim with their treaty enforcers, the Thalmor Justicars, to ensure that the Talos ban wouldn't be dishonoured again. This day saw the founding of the Stormcloaks, and was arguably the starting point of the civil war within Skyrim. But as time progressed, tension got worse throughout all of Skyrim, and Jarl Ulfric was at the centre of it. Because of this, Ulfric challenged the rule of Torrig, the High King of Skyrim, with whoever winning the challenge to be crowned the true ruler of all of Skyrim. Due to the traditions of the Nordic people, Torrig accepted and faced Ulfric in a battle to the death. However, within this battle, Jarl Ulfric would use his power of the voice to shout the unrelenting force at Torrig, throwing him off, and with some reports saying killing him instantly. This immediately split opinions, with some saying it was a fair 1-to-1 battle, with others such as General Tullius saying Ulfric had broken tradition and manipulated the events to usurp the throne. After this event, Ulfric fled back to Windhelm, being labelled by the Legion as a traitor who had committed regicide, and plunged Skyrim into chaos. Later, as Ulfric and his men were venturing over the Dark Water crossing, the Legion would ambush him and his men and capture him, putting him into transport to execute him in front of the Thalmor at the town of Helgen. Everything seemed to be going in perfect order for the Legion as they ticked off their prisoners on their lists. However, completely unexpected as the execution started, a dragon as black as night flew over the top of Helgen and started its attack, allowing Ulfric and the Stormcloaks to escape once again. But now everyone in Skyrim had bigger problems. The dragons had returned after centuries being banished. Ulduin was resurrecting his brothers and sisters with the goal of becoming gods over the mortals once again, as well as getting his revenge. Throughout this fourth era, the people of Skyrim would repeat the history of their people all over again, fighting off the dragons, engaging in civil war, fighting off the influence of elves, and even forming together the companions who honoured Ysgramor's legacy. With the war now won and the dragons being banished once again, it is unknown what the fate of Skyrim is, or who will win the war between the Legion and the Stormcloaks. However, if their history has told us anything, it's that nothing ultimately changes. And no matter who is in power, war will always happen between factions over religion, land, or just power. And while Skyrim is a beautiful landscape with dramatic looking areas and lovely villages and cities, it's fair to say that this region of Tamriel is not for the faint of heart. Hey you're finally awake. Thanks for watching this long video on the history of Skyrim. I hope you all enjoyed this look into the Elder Scrolls lore, and more specifically this video. Do let me know if you want to see more of this and what topics you'd like covered from this series. Do make sure you leave a like, a nice comment, and subscribe if you haven't already, as well as checking out my other lore playlists in the description below. And if you really love this video, why not support me on Patreon or as a YouTube channel member for early access to these videos, as well as them being completely ad-free. And speaking of which, I'd like to thank my supporters real quick. Big thanks to our small fish guys, our big fishes Christopher, Andrew, Last Persona User and Artocrem, our shark Whale Such Gaming, and our huge megalodons Sinus, Jacob Garcia, Chernobyl Stalker, Shadow SGT and Ryan Everett. Also big shout out to our YouTube channel members, our Wise Ones Jambu and Fiery Italian. All your support means the world to me and means I can make these videos for you, so thank you all so very much. But that is all for now. Thank you again for watching, and I shall see you all in the next one. Cheers.